Hello all! Yesterday I posted a review for Dazzling Brightness by Roberta Gellis, and only through great strength of will did I stop myself from spending the whole book review talking almost entirely about this amazing author. So I've come back to do that right now. If my bird allows. He's got opinions. Hi, hi. So Roberta Leah Jacobs Gellis. Possibly Jealous. I don't know if I've pronounced it Roberta Gellis my whole life, but, and I mean my whole life, I started reading these as a teenager. However, I have not, in fact, ever met, say hello, anyone else who has read, in real life, who has read these books. So Gellis, Jealous, I don't know. Possibly this video will reach someone who does actually read this author and can correct me. I can't wait to discussing her with someone. So, born in 1927, I was astonished when, in the ripe old age of 20 or 30, I discovered she was actually American. I first encountered her through her Rosalind series, which is medieval England. And I just assumed that someone with that much knowledge of the era and the history would be English. I was wrong. She was an American writer. She held 2 degrees, one in medieval literature and the other in biochemistry. Actually, I'm wrong, not degrees, she had master's degrees in both of those, which is awesome in itself. She is primarily known as a writer of historic fiction, romantic fiction, and fantasy, but she wrote everything. She wrote all the stuffs. I don't have anywhere near all the stuffs. I think she had something like 50 books in total, and I wish I had them all. I don't. So she had a research lab job in New York City, possibly, according to one part of the internet. But she gave that up when her son was born, and she started writing her first novels. Her first novels were medieval, and depending on where you go, the first one was Bond of Blood and Knight's Honor. Here we've got Knight's Honor. Other places claim that Knight's Honor, sometime in the 1960s, was her first novel. So I've got to say, this one was published in 1964. It's got a map of England that tells you where you're going to be reading about. And it's got this very naff cover. It is so very much romantic fiction of the 60s. We've got that guy who's dressed in what can only be presumed to be medieval garb because the person who drew it knew nothing about medieval garb. And the woman standing in front of him is wearing a very SCA notion of what medieval women wore. She's got those long braids and she's got a skin tone that suggests that she was of First Nations American descent. In fact, she was not. She was English. I didn't read this book until fairly later in my Roberta Gellis reading career. I forgot this one, The Sword and the Swan, clearly from the same era, and indeed exactly the same colour in that guy's cloak and that guy's whatever that's meant to be, tabard possibly. That's interesting. I never noticed that before. And The Dragon and the Rose. I have to say that Knight's Honor was the worst. The Sword and the Swan and The Dragon and the Rose were both okay-ish. They weren't her best. So she was writing these very much in the genre of medieval romance fiction, but much like her later books, 30 distinct works, by the way, in Goodreads. Much like her later works, there's always a romance. There are always people to connect between, and that was the case between Dazzling Brightness. You had a female protagonist and you had a male protagonist. They come alive sharply, they're good characters, they're actually very relatable and enjoyable characters, especially for 60s romance writing, where I've got to tell you, characters and situations were often not spectacular. Roberta Gellis's are always spectacular, however. even in these early ones, I think her main flaw in her really earliest books was she was sticking very, very closely to the history as she knew it. And in history as she knew it, women didn't have an incredibly vibrant or a very independent lifestyle. So, moving on to the Rosalind Chronicles. The Rosalind Chronicles were published, I believe, also in the 60s. Let's find the first one. There we go, Rosalind. Rosalind was published by Hamlin Paperbacks in 1978. So I'm guessing there were a few in between. Rosalind is where I picked up this author from a second-hand table way back in the day when I was a teenager. And I was reading a lot of romances as a teenager, and I liked history. I wanted to like history. I'd get out history books and I'd try to read them, but I really hadn't learned it at school and there was no context for it. I couldn't make it fit into a worldview. I couldn't make it mean something. And Roberta Gellis did that for me. Starting with Rosalind, she's created an epic fantasy fable of a family based around a keep. So you've got the whole genealogy of the DeVoe family, and it's based around a keep. The keep is called Rosalind because it's got wild roses all over it, very romancy, but the keep is awesome. It's not real. As I read it, I seem to remember believing it was based somewhere on the southern English coast between Dover and Land's End. And I assumed that because later in the story, a mention is made of piracy in the Big Sea. So, we've got Rosalind. The main character in that book is Eleanor, who pursues and eventually marries a much older knight. She pursues him to the Holy Land on King Richard's crusades. Rosalind starts just as King Richard has come into possession of England, freed his mother, Queen Eleanor of the Courts of Love, and she has come to England to take possession of it. At that point, Eleanor is an heiress of this castle and she's unmarried. I think she's 15 or 16 when it starts. And so she's taken in as a ward of King Richard. Her estate money that would otherwise be hers goes to her protector and she goes to court. Okay, following on from Eleanor, the next one is Joanna. That's her daughter. As in many upper-class families, having children is the big deal. Eleanor has two with her first husband. The first is a daughter, that's Joanna. And Joanna is heir to Rosalind as Eleanor was. After that one, we have her first son with her first husband is pursued as he marries Gillian. Then we have one where her second son that she has with her second husband marries I think that's pronounced Hiranon in Welsh, but I'm not sure because I don't speak Welsh. And then finally we have Sibel. That's about her daughter's daughter, Joanna's daughter. And I'm not showing these extensively because, as you can see, they scream old school romance at you. There's the roses, every one of them almost is named after a woman. And you've got these very schmaltzy covers which suggest to you that it's a bodice ripper, and it's not. That's what kept me reading the first time and has kept me reading ever since. Roberta Gellis knew history and she wrote about it. In these books, you've got castles being sacked. You have got all the details about how a person sacks a castle. You've got politics. The politics of Richard and King Richard and King John and King Henry and all the things that were happening. How Richard was great at wars but failed to conquer Wales. How he went on crusade for various reasons that are kind of suggested at times but not gone into extensively. John and his administration. King John was much loathed for many years, but I feel that Roberta Gellis portrays him, all the bad things that people hated about him that was very period, while also mentioning all the things that he did administration-wise. He was a far superior king than his brother Richard, but everyone loved Richard, everyone loathed John. You've got this balance of politics as seen through the eyes of real people who are trying to live their life. And they are spectacular. Without these books, I might never have loved history, because finally they gave me a hook to understand history in terms of its politics, its land rights, what being a baron meant, what being a serf meant, what all of this meant contextually in the real world of people living it. So, I love those. I love the details of how castles were managed in Gillian, or Gillian, I'm not sure how you pronounce that one either. You've got a French heiress being brought to England to consolidate the French possession. She ends up in the Rosalind family. But you've got these fantastic images of her being brought to this keep that hasn't had a mistress for a long time and trying to make sense of it. It's like all the imagery of castles that I have to bring when I visit a castle, all the knowledge of how the kitchens work, how the garderobes work, everything started for me with these books. And they are still very readable. Now, the problem with these books is that most of them I've read so often that I'm virtually word perfect, but that doesn't really stop me from picking them up and reading once again the story of how Bexhill was conquered. Fantastic books, if you like that sort of thing. If you don't want a book with a primary romance, and if you can't swallow the fact that you've got a strong woman in charge of her own possessions, then this won't work. At the end of it, Roberta Gellis makes quite clear that this is fiction. And she mentions the individual women that were strong and did keep their own lands and their own possessions, like Nicola de la Haye, who appears in one of these books during a major historical battle. But she also makes certain that we know that this portrayal of women feminine owning their own lands is atypical, not historical of its era. So, to me, these earlier books is where she's talking about the history but hasn't quite figured out how to make the characters both historical and engaging, whereas then in the Rosalind series, you've got it all. It's fantastic. Okay, so books by Roberta Gellis. That's the Rosalind Chronicles, and that's the really early ones. Now, later on, you've got a series that's named after its main protagonist, Magdalene Labertard. I don't actually think, I think that they're a little bit further along. It's been a while since I read this one. These were published in the 90s, by which time she was an excellent, excellent author. I think she had a natural propensity for writing and engagement that is undeniable and entirely spontaneous. But as she wrote more and more, her writing became better and better. Okay, A Mortal Bane is the first one of the Magdalena Labertard series. And I think it's the first one. Hang on, let me check with the internet before I lie to you. Yes, there we go, A Mortal Bane. It's the only one of the series that I possess, though I have read a couple of others. I would love to get my hands on them one day. It starts on prologue, 19th of April, 1139 at St. Mary Overy. And here we've got an entirely different class to what we got in those early books and in the Rosalind series. What we've got is someone who isn't of the nobility and doesn't have that strength or that property or that protection. Magdalena is a madam. She started off as a whore, and she, through careful curating of her clients, she has progressed to the point where she has a modest house with 3 or 4 girls, I think, in them. And it's essentially a brothel, an 1100s brothel. But she, I think she's pretty sure that she's a bastard and can't claim any family, but she's moderately educated, and the girls she chooses are intelligent, sometimes educated, and they cater to a very specific part of the nobility and the clergy. Now, I think in A Mortal Bane it is that we have a girl who is beautiful, fairly well born, but blind and so cast out. And in these ones, you see a side of the medievals that I hadn't encountered before at all. So the clergy and their power, and the power they had over the people. And because Magdalena has got a protector in the clergy, she can continue to have this establishment right under the patronage, the non-acknowledged patronage of the church. Now, these are unlike the other books in that the other books deal with wars and affairs of state and affairs of the heart. These ones are all murder mysteries. I think they're all murder mysteries, actually. They're all mysteries. In each one of these, Magdalena has to solve a mystery, usually with a dead body involved, in order to protect her house and her girls. And they are not the chonkers that the earlier books were, but they are exceptionally well written and exceptionally fun. I would love to get my hands on all of them and reread them again. Still in the historical region, we've got this one. I've read this many times. I like it. It's probably the most traditional romance bodice ripper type book of the lot. And I can't look at this cover without wincing. The Rope Dancer by Roberta Gellis. Don't judge. Okay, judge, but judge the publisher and the artist, because this cover is crap. No historical woman ever wore a dress like that. They didn't wear lycra for a start, and if I've ever seen a lycra dress, that blue shimmying thing is it. Sorry. Okay, this one was published in the 80s, so in between the Rosalind series and the early ones, and the Magdalene de Batard ones from the 90s. Rope Dancer is really interesting because though it's set in the same era as her more traditional, by her standards, traditional type knights and ladies, swords and politics series, the class is different. The Rope Dancer is literally a rope dancer. So she was a street performer and she travelled with a troupe, and we see a little bit of the truly harsh and completely and utterly horrific conditions of travelling entertainers. There is a bit of a habit in some historical fiction to romanticize the life of a travelling player or a travelling bard, and The Rope Dancer by Roberta Gellis completely strips those illusions away. It was hard, it was muddy, you starved, you probably died early, anyone could do anything to you, and there was no one to protect you. It's harsh and it's edgy beyond this silly cover description. So what The Rope Dancer is about is a girl called Caris who could dance, apparently very well, and there was a bard called Teller. Now, he was a wandering minstrel, and never, if you ever want to read it, just don't read any of this. It's codswallop. He's a wandering minstrel. He doesn't want to be saddled by this rope dancer, but she ends up being thrown out of a keep, and she sticks with him. And he's horrified. He's not noble born, but he's still fairly well born, well enough born to know what to do with a bar, and she doesn't. And she's completely illiterate, and it's this enemies to lovers with her grasping onto him desperately because she has got nothing else to grasp onto. And slowly he comes to see her good points. It's actually a pretty good book, but it is most traditionally romance of any of the Roberta Gellis as I've read, possibly up to Dazzling Brightness. Dazzling Brightness is allegedly, and according to this book, the actual literal meaning of what Persephone in ancient Greece is, which is what she was named by Hades. There are 5 books in the Greek mythology series, and this is the only one of them that I have. So, yes, okay, let's go dive into this pile here. Sing Witch, Sing Death, Roberta Gellis. I love this. And here we have got a terrifying story of a young woman driven by the bond of an illicit lover into deadly grasp of black magic. Yes, Yes, it's a Bantam Gothic novel. And Roberta Gellis wrote Bantam Gothic novels, apparently. It's a long time since I've read that. It might be due a reread. She also wrote a couple of modern thrillery romancy books. This is the only one of them I've ever read. It's called A Delicate Balance. It is billed as the best-selling author of the Roslyn Chronicles. I remember reading it once and thinking the socialite, the invalid, the nephew, and the lover. It left me moderately disinterested. It's not an era that I love, but if I'm going to read anything from this era, Roberta Gellis, you win. Where else? Let's talk about The Serrated Edge. So The Serrated Edge is a series of books by Mercedes Lackey. Mercedes Lackey is an author who wrote a lot of fiction, and I've got quite a bit of it, and somewhere up the top there. I like much of it, some of it's pretty bad. The longer she wrote, the lazier she got, and the worse it got. Sorry, I hate to say that, but it's true. However, at one point, she had a series called Serrated Edge. It included Roads, Elves on the Road, Bedlam Bard, Urban Elves, Bottle of Gin, things like that. As in D-I-J-I-N-N, Gin, if you please. And then there were the prequels, which she wrote with Mercedes Lackey. They are, in sequence, This Sceptred Isle. Yes, we're talking chonkers again. Ill Met by Moonlight. By Slanderous Tongues. And Less Than Kind, which I have in hardcover. I'd much rather have a paperback, but there you go. This is, once again, history. This is the history of King Henry VIII and his daughters, Elizabeth and Mary. And in this alternative telling, we've got the history from Roberta Gellis, and we've got the fantasy coming from Mercedes Lackey. The idea here is that you've got the Seelie and the Unseelie Fae elves, as it were, and they involve themselves in the affairs of mankind. In fact, the Seelie and the Unseelie essentially use what's happening on Earth as a way of combating each other and scoring points off each other. So in the early ones, they start to delineate who belongs to who, and no surprises to anyone who knows that history, Elizabeth ends up being the province of the Seelie court. They contact her when she's very young, and they don't want to use the word groom, but they help form her opinions, and eventually she actually does visit the Seelie realms. Mary, on the other hand, is thoroughly taken over by the Unseelie, and I think this comes in with the whole notion of the religious wars of England under the Tudors. Okay, there's a lot of these to read, and I have read them all more than once, but not recently. All I remember is that they are beautifully written. The history was what got me there. At times, the mucking around in Elfland got a bit much, but not until about the third or fourth book. The first one is the one that I've read most often because it is so good, and By Slanderous Tongues was absolutely fantastic as well. I really loved them. I won't talk about them too much more because this is already turning into a long video and I haven't read them recently. If you want to know more about those, I suggest ISFDB, because ISFDB has Mercedes Lackey listed, and if anything ever proved that she wasn't just your romance writer, this is it. So she's got Gothic, she's got fantasy, romantic fantasy, and historical fantasy there. And in addition, she has science fiction. She wrote science fiction with pseudonyms, and I can't remember what they were, though if I have written them down somewhere, and I'll write them down in the description below when I find them. She had, I think, at least one, possibly three very pulpy sounding science fictions. I didn't know about the pseudonym until fairly recently, so I haven't read them. I would like to find them. In addition to all of those, oh, here we go. Hang on. I did make a note. She wrote Space Guardians in 1978 under the pseudonym of Max Daniels. Have you read Max Daniels? You think you have. You've actually read Roberta Gellis. And then Offworld in 1979, also as Max Daniels. Those two are the science fiction ones. She's also got a few other ones, Bull God, Thrice Bound, and Overstar's Mail Imperial Challenge. Those novels are listed along with the Gothic Sing Witch, Sing Death as standalones. Okay, the Myth Trilogy on ISFDB, by the way, only mentions 3 books, of which this is the first, but on other locations of the internet it lists 5. I do believe there are various websites dedicated to Roberta Gellis, but I haven't been able to find any in English, so I couldn't really go there. In addition to all this wonderful stuff, she has got about 10 short fiction, none of which, to my sorrow, have I ever encountered. Tom, Rarer Than a White Crow, Witch Continuum, as in a witchy witch, not choose which. There's Bride Price, The Third Song, Legacy, Witch Cite, again, witchy witch, Moses Miracles, and Compere. Compere, I believe, the short fiction, is the last thing she wrote in 2011. Roberta Gellis, very sadly, is lost to the world with all her immense talent, having died in 2016. She also has 3 essays. One is considered the essay. It's the author's note or the epilogue at the back of Dazzling Brightness, some of which I read aloud in my review yesterday. She's got 1 Welcome Irish Magic, that's it. She's got 2 Irish Magic books, which I gather are listed under fantasy or mythology. And I'm going to assume that Welcome Irish Magic, she wrote the introduction to it. And the book is a compendium, as far as I know. There's 2 of them, with Morgan Thulvan, or Llewellyn, however you pronounce it, Barbara and Samuels, and Susan Wiggs. And she's also got an essay called The Dursleys as Social Commentary that was published in 2006. And that one I'm interested enough in that I might even be willing to read it online or as an ebook. Okay, what else shall we say about Roberta Gellis? There's a whole heap of personal information about her if you're interested. Wikipedia doesn't do a bad job, and like I said, there's more on ISFDB. Her personal life really, I think, is beside the point. That's personal. But she has 3 awards. The first one is Best Series Writer of 1983 from the Romantic Times. She has got the 1984 Porgy Gold Medal for Best Historical Romance and the 1986 Romance Writers of America's Lifetime Achievement Award, as well she should. I think it's a little bit of a travesty that all of her awards are solely for romance, because while she did write romance, many of these are essentially romance. They are so much more. And the lack of ability to recognize the fantasy element or the pure writing talent or the historical mystery talent. She deserves more, I feel. Okay, here I have found my other note. She had pseudo-anonymous books, which she had at least 3 pseudonyms, as well as the Max Daniels one, which I mentioned for the science fiction. She had Leah Jacobs and Priscilla Hamilton, and I'm going to guess that those were pseudonyms which she used for her more modern fiction, romance fiction-y stuff. Not sure about that. Okay, what else can I say? She also had 2 books called The Tales of Genève. I don't know very much about them. I picture them as something like the Fionnavar Tapestries by Guy Gabriel Kay, but I'm not sure. They're called Tapestry of Dreams and Fires of Winter. And she's got a whole series set in the Napoleonic era. Once again, you've got that very, very good history capacity matched with individual characters to bring the history into real life for you. Now, I don't own any of those, weep, weep, sad, sad, but I have read a couple of them. There's The English Heiress, The Cornish Heiress, The Kent Heiress, Fortune's Bride, and A Woman's Estate. And I remember them as very good indeed. I am not sure when they were published even. Okay, Magdalene de la Batard, once again, I've mentioned them as mysteries. They are historical mysteries, 12th century madam turned amateur detective. Very well written. And she also wrote a book about Lucretia Borgia. That was written in the early 2000s, so she would have been well into her craft by then. And yeah, that's a basic coverage of some of the wide range of books written by Roberta Gellis. I think I'm about due for a reread of Sing Witch, Sing Death. And I've been craving some good old gothic novels. Maybe I'll reread that. So, as you can tell, I am vastly impressed by this author. I have never read anything by hers that wasn't engaging. And recently reading this, which is far out of the lane that I've been reading recently, I remembered how a really competent, really skillful author can engage and enchant you as you read the book you're reading. I probably wouldn't say that these days, if you're strongly into history, these will necessarily engage your interest. But if your interest in history isn't that acute, if you want to read a little bit of history, but you want it linked to the personal feeling, good protagonists that you can bond with, definitely Roberta Gellis did that. She created women you could believe in. She created men you could believe in, and then she put them in scenarios and parts of history and fantasy where you couldn't help but find yourself sucked into those stories. So, if anything that I've said sounds interesting to you, find a Roberta Gellis and read it, whichever one sounds best to you. If it's Max Daniels especially, I've never seen those, I would love to hear from you. And if you're in America, you will probably find these more accessible than I do here in Australia. So, good luck. Happy hunting. And even if you haven't heard a single book from Roberta Gellis that you really want to read, you should still go away and read good books. Thanks for watching.